Everybody, welcome to my presentation uh, entitled A Brief Examination of the Challenges to an Airport Manager by Matthew Dillon, and it's for AVM 2410 Airport Management. Topics for discussion are a brief history of airports to gather a good foundation for the rest of the presentation here, airport layout, financing and ownership, as well as economic and social political aspects of running an airport. I chose these topics specifically because this is what I thought the major challenges to an airport manager would be. Obviously there are a lot more topics of discussion, but I just really cannot cover that in one paper or one discussion presentation here. So here we go. So we'll start out with a brief history-ish, and let's get into it. So, military is what kind of drives a lot of advancements in technology and in modern life. You know, we wouldn't have penicillin, we wouldn't have, aircraft were mostly, originally at least, used and intended for military use in the beginning. Aircraft up into the mid-20s after 1903, Wright brothers flight up into the mid-20s was mostly used for military, and then U.S. Postal Service used aircraft as well. But the first airport that had the first commercial use type of deal was Hounslow Heath Aerodrome in London, England, and this would actually be the place that actually had the first commercial flight, and it went from England to Paris. The airport itself was actually just a grass runway with a single structure, what we would call an FBO today, fixed base operator. So after World War I and prior to World War II, many airports had grass runways. That was just because aircraft really didn't need asphalt or concrete runways, and they were too light and kind of fragile at this point. I mean, it's nothing more than like a balsa wood model airplane at that point. So, however, during this time period, aircraft became larger and faster after World War II, or between this time period, World War I and World War II. So they would start to need better runway surfaces to land these larger aircraft. We think of the B-17 Flying Fortress military bomber from back in World War II. We think of that as a World War II bomber, but it was actually designed in the mid-1930s. So that kind of gives you a perspective of the size of the aircraft during the mid-30s up into World War II, which for the U.S. started in 1941. And even airports that did have paved runways during this time, so after World War I and then through World War II, they started having paved runways, but it was just a runway and necessarily wasn't taxiways or parking areas. So up until the jet age, this is where airports started to become what we see airports as today. They had multiple structures and lots of asphalt everywhere, for your taxiways, your parking, your what we call the aprons, I guess. Lots of parking structures for, automobiles out front and things like that. So that's the early 50s is basically when airports really started to change. Commercial aviation became larger and more evolved, needing airports to expand and to help with the increasing number of passengers and flights in and out of the airports. So up until the 1970s, mid to late 70s, we also had regulation. And regulation during these times were really strict. It was all government regulation, and basically what they would do is they set pricing for passenger tickets. They set minimum requirements for aircraft and scheduling as well. So until the 1976 and 1978, which was a revision of the Airline Deregulation Act, they became signed into law. And deregulation would help to lessen that governmental stranglehold, but it would allow the competition of airlines to happen. So that would keep the prices under control. And because airlines were looking for that edge, they would also, start to service different areas that they wouldn't, before. So, Orlando during this time was one of those areas that wasn't really served because Disney World It was kind of around, but it wasn't yet a major attraction. So it was still kind of considered a small airport until after deregulation, really. And then, it became one of those airports, that Daytona became one of those airports that major airlines would start to fly into. Somewhere in the mix of the things between the jet age and the deregulation, 14 CFR Part 139 was also written, which are the minimum requirements for an airport to operate. Just like FAA Part 91 and 121 for private and commercial operations of aircraft. So the next topic of discussion we're going to move into is capacity. Capacity is the amount of operations an airport can handle in a period of time, generally measured on an hour per hour basis. The average single runway can generally handle 60 aircraft per hour, and this number will increase with the more runways and proper ATC routing. Air traffic is going to increase in the upcoming years, so forecasting for airports is a very, very important in determining the future of the airport, especially the land needed. So you can't build those extra runways if you don't have the land available. Same thing goes with taxiways and terminals, but we'll also get into that later on in this presentation. And then capacity also determines how much funding an airport will receive through grants or other governmental assistance, which is something else we'll also get into in the financing part of it. But basically, the more capacity, the more money that they'll be able to have available for upgrades and updates. Airport layout is the next thing. So you can see that's a mighty fine looking airport down there. I believe it's Chicago O'Hare, yeah. So there's Lake O'Hare down here. They call it right in the center of the airport. So layout of an airport is more than just a runway or taxiways and some buildings. There are a lot of things that go into determining an airport layout, and this is a very important aspect to the whole broad picture of things. So things that are taken into account for layout are wind direction, the city and community around it. So you also have to think about noise, ground traffic. That can also be a huge problem. Think like LAX or Chicago or something. And then companies to supply and run the airport. So if you're out in the middle of nowhere and you can't get trucks in to fuel aircraft or bring food and supplies in, there's no sense on having that airport out there. And then you have to consider traffic patterns, capacity, empty land for future growth. That's a big deal, like I was alluding to earlier. That whole capacity thing. So if you have the capacity and you have the money to grow, but you don't have the area around to grow, then there's no sense on even trying to push for further growth at that airport. You might have to rethink your whole strategy and build a whole new airport, especially with cities and towns encroaching on areas like around airports. And then it also ultimately comes down to financing and the amount of business an airport will see. So again, that capacity thing, if there's not enough capacity coming in, then there's not going to be any revenue coming in, so there's no sense on upgrading it. So the next topic here we're going to touch on is ownership and financing. Most airports are owned by the government, so whether it's a city, county, state, or federal. However, airports can also be co-owned or fully owned by private entities. Either way, airports are ran like businesses and rely upon income to stay alive. So basically, if there's no business coming in, then how can you keep the lights on? It's sounds very basic, but I mean that's really what it comes down to. But airports can rely on outside financing by private or government to make improvements. So that would be that whole, like if it's a governmental owned as well as like maybe co-owned with a private entity, well, those two can merge their financing and, allow for more financing option or a bigger financing option to do bigger renovations or upgrades. Airlines also have a lot to do with the financing. So basically, if you go buy a house or rent a house or an apartment from somebody, it's kind of the same thing with the airlines. The airlines will rent a big portion or a whole terminal and they will basically be responsible for the upkeep, but a lot of them will upgrade and do the updates to make it flashy, a little bit more comfortable if they can. Some airports aren't like that, others are. Just think of like British Airways and their first class their first class terminals that they have over in like Heathrow or even here in like JFK. It should also be known that if an airport is co-owned or funded by the government, then the airport must be for public use without any type of discrimination. So I think, we kind of touched on that topic with the security. There's like people felt like they were discriminated against, and there was kind of those lawsuits against the TSA because technically airports are public use, unless it's private use, and those are not really around. There aren't too many of those. I guess you could think of John Travolta's private airport at his house up there in Ocala area. So the next thing we'll move on to is the economic and social and political aspect of things, and this is kind of one of them touchy subjects that really nobody wants to do, especially around the dinner table at home. So just be careful on when and where you talk about politics. So as far as like airport management challenges, they kind of have to be that middleman, so to speak. They're kind of caught between their board of directors, they're caught between the community and airport authorities and so on and so forth. So, and this is because airports are a huge player in the local economy. So, I mean, they bring in thousands or at least hundreds of jobs, purchases, like foods and fuels and everything else that might be needing to supply an airport. As well as shipping, they need trucking, and then as well as construction and things like that. So socially, the community may have grown to a point that houses and businesses are too close to the airport, at which point noise and traffic, as far as automobile traffic, becomes a concern. So we kind of touched on that before. It is a huge problem, and it's having to be dealt with at certain airports. You're starting to see a lot more airports. I mean, it's been around for years, but airports more recently are starting to add curfews. Not being able to take off before sunrise, and then have to limit their flying in, and at like 9-10 o'clock at night, they have to stop operations, and that's just because of these noise abatement issues, and that's a huge problem. And that airport manager, he's kind of or he or she are like right in the middle of the thick of it. They have to go and sit in on these these board meetings, and then they also have to sit in on the like city council meetings and listen to what the public has to say and see if they can find like a common ground to stand on, to where the business of the airport can make money, as well as being able to keep people happy as far as having their houses nearby, which I don't understand, but anyway. And then politically, as far as things go there, laws that change on a federal, state, or local level will also have an impact on how an airport operates. So again, those noise abatement issues, it's an idea at first, and then it becomes a law. The local government will pass that law, and they have to abide by it. Fuel taxing and different things like that. So there is a lot of laws that go into it, and that's where parts 14.139 comes from, and that's basically, that's the laws of the land for the airports, basically. So, in conclusion, all of these topics are just a small portion of the challenges an airport manager must deal with. The best rule of thumb to understand where the airport manager falls into the mix is to think of them as a boss who is also the middleman in most situations. So this is the end of my presentation. Hope you all enjoyed. Happy holidays, no matter what you celebrate or if you don't. And good luck in your future. If you see me around campus or something like that, come by and say hello. I don't bite, so I'd like to meet everybody if I can. So have a good day. Here's my picture references.